Hello there. Welcome to another episode of the Global Conversations webcast. In this episode, this is part 2 of our discussion on cultural diversity, where this time we will focus on emotions with our special guest, Batja Mesquita. Cultural diversity shapes how we feel, express, and interpret emotions. Batja Mesquita, a social cultural psychologist and an effective scientist, has studied this topic extensively and has written a book which I've actually had an opportunity to read, Between Us, How Cultures Create Emotions. Her research investigates how emotions vary across cultures and how cultural values and beliefs shape our emotional experiences. She has explored the role of social identity and emotions in intergroup relations. So as we discuss cultural diversity and emotions with Batja, we'll explore how cultural differences impact our emotions and how we increase our awareness and understand our diverse emotional expressions, especially how it relates to our organizational cultures and dynamics. Welcome, Batja.
Thank you, Andre, for having me.
Thanks, Batja. Just before we were having our conversation, it's so interesting because before we had our first conversation prior to this, we talked about the fact that I moved to Amsterdam. I went to Amsterdam for a conference, and then now we've caught up on that. And it's funny that I'm having a conversation with someone who is Dutch. So now, and we were just talking about the cultural diversity of the city, the emotions, the language, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, this is kind of a great segue from my time in Amsterdam to this conversation where we talk about the emotions and whatnot. So with that, I mean, Batja, the floor is yours. I'd like the audience to know, or for them to know, who you are, your book, research interests, passions, etc. So tell the audience about yourself.
That's a lot to tell. I am, as you said, I'm Dutch, a native of Amsterdam. I didn't grow up there all the time, but I was born there and returned there. It's probably interesting to know that I'm from a Jewish family originally, and so my family was like, I think, everybody who was Jewish and in Europe at the time. My parents were in hiding and so survived the World War II. And I think it did two things with me, I think, as a person. The first thing it did with me is that I lived with parents and with, the remaining family, which was not so large. My mom was actually an orphan coming out of the war, but that there were emotions about things that I didn't immediately understand. So emotions that came from a time or from things that happened that were not totally obvious to me. So that's one of the reasons I think that I became kind of a psychologically minded child. I wanted to figure out how people felt. And I also remember as a child that I wanted to help people with their emotions. So initially, I wanted to become a psychiatrist. It didn't happen. And the other thing is that I got, and who knows in retrospect what came first and what came later, but I've always been interested in social justice. And I think it's also part of knowing how, discrimination and racism in its time could shape lives and, how it was really important. And so I wanted people to understand diversity, and I wanted to bridge differences. And as I remember as a child that I was intrigued by people in different cultures very early on. There were these different cultures. It wasn't so much, my background wasn't particularly religious, but there were very religious people and I didn't understand them too. So that's part of my personal background, I think. And then I started studying psychology, and the person whom I found most interesting, my professor, was just writing a book on emotions. And so it became sort of naturally my question of, and at the time, people were pretty convinced, the field was pretty convinced, this field of psychology, that, well, there were all these differences, but emotions at least were universal. And so I was charged with the task as a Ph.D., a doctoral student. I was charged with a task to find if there was anything different across cultures about emotions. And by the end of my dissertation, I thought, a lot is different. And actually, people do emotions in a way that fits their culture. They do emotions because of their culture, their emotions. Now, having said that, we're all human beings. We all have a body and a brain. We all care about other people. Certain other people, I should say. We all care about our position in a group. I mean, we don't want to be excluded, for example. We want to have some position. We want to have friends. We're all exposed to losses of people, losses of people, losses of position. So I think there are a lot of things in the human condition that make for similarity. Mm-hmm. Now, we care about those things in a slightly different way, of course. How we make those groups, what is important in those relationships is slightly different. There is diversity, but I think when I talk about different emotions, it's not like some people have emotions, others don't. It's everybody has emotions about the kinds of things they care. And actually, in the things we care, there is a lot of similarity as well as differences, mm-hmm. because we care that other people approve of us. But what makes other people approve of us, for example, is very different across cultures. Yeah. So I think that's and I did I started my research in Amsterdam, actually at first studying Dutch people with a majority background, but then also some of the groups that at that time hadn't been in the Netherlands for so long, which was Turkish, Turkish people originating from guest workers in the 70s, and Surinamese people who came, Suriname used to be a colony, got its independence in 1970, and a lot of people came from Suriname here. I mean, there was always some exchange, but mm-hmm. those were the groups that I concentrated on. And then as I moved, I became interested in different kind of cultures. So I moved to the United States. And maybe a part of my, and not unimportant part, is that when I did my Ph.D., I was the person who had always remained in the Netherlands. And so I was interested in these exotic people, who came to the Netherlands. When I went to the States myself, that was actually, I had lived in a number of different European places, but I became an exotic person when I moved to the United States, I think. I became the odd one out. And so I had the experience of being a minority and being an immigrant. And that was very instructive also. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, that's about myself and my research and how I came to start. The book I wrote because after not quite 30 years, but maybe 25, I thought, I know all these things, but I have no way of communicating to people in the real world. People always ask me what I felt were the wrong questions, and I never knew how to even start a conversation. And the book was my way of communicating with the world. And, I think that happened as a result of the book. So how well I'm able to do that, we'll see. But
no, I mean, like we said at the outset, we talk about our emotions and our gestures and whatnot, and how we said that my time in Amsterdam, there's the universal hands gestures or even facial recognition, but we still try and say the same thing regardless of the language. I mean, but that's something that we all have in common somehow, right? So that's why it made me comfortable being in Amsterdam, because of the fact that, number one, I never had been to Europe. Number two, obviously I'd never been to Amsterdam. So this is my first foray into being in a different culture, a different country outside of the US. So, and Trinidad. And now it's like, we were just talking about, people with, who are native English speakers who don't want to learn the language or be immersed in different cultures. And there's a portion of that in Canada, there's a portion of that in the US, where people just they're comfortable in their own zones. So so these are things, and that's and then I honestly, I don't remember how your book came how it came across, but I mean, I was like, you know what, I love cultures, I love people. So this is why I just decided, you know what, I'm going to just get Batja's book. And I was simply amazed by all the conversations that you, all the themes that you had in terms of, multicultural differences, being connected, language differences, etc. So is there anything you'd like to add to that when it came to, not only your research, but also why you chose those themes in your book as an example?
Yeah, I think a part of the choice of the themes is what we know. What do we have knowledge about? I mean, we as in, scientists, psychologists, but also anthropologists. And I chose the themes probably because they were the clear. So I really talk about a lot of things, but I talk about 4 domains of emotions. And I think that's what you're referring to. And I chose anger emotions, shame emotions, and then I say, you could call it happinesses and loves, except there are not all happinesses and loves. I just show that, as obvious as those emotions seem to be and as universal, they're not. And they're not, and they're, not everybody thinks the same and about anger or shame, and not everybody thinks that anger is the better emotion and shame is the worse emotion. And in many cultures, it's the opposite. Not everybody thinks happiness is important at all. And not everybody thinks that happiness is something good. And love is not being close to another person, but it's, there's all these ways of having relationships to close others that involve not just finding that other person, not just putting that other person on a pedestal and enjoying that other person, but it's sometimes also, pitying the other person or making sure there are boundaries between you and the other person. I mean, there's a lot of nuance. And what I try to show is that emotions cannot be separated from the relationships in which they occur. And of course, there are cultural differences in the way we do those relationships. And so why do I choose those emotions? I think I could have chosen other emotions like jealousy or sadness, but these primarily because I've done some research about it, because other people have done some research about it, because they're emotions that I think people in the West or my North American audience that I wrote for would think were obvious, and I try to say no, they're not obvious, but really they're instruments. I think those examples are instruments for me to show how emotions are related to the culture and how emotions are, and that's one of the answers that I prepared for another question you asked, but I can say it now, but I want to show people that emotions are not, in the first place, feelings inside, but in the first place, they're stories between people as they play out between people in the world. And those emotions allow me to illustrate that. So I can say, what happens? What happens when I tell the story of anger? What is my typical story of anger, if there is such thing? And so I think I tell stories about these emotions. It's not the only thing I do in the book, but that's a big part of where I illustrate the ideas of the book.
Yeah, and I think I remember, like, correct me if I'm wrong, I know it was an Asian culture of I don't know if it was Chinese or Japanese, where you mentioned about the culture of shame when it's about approval, I believe it was. And yeah, and it was, and it was fascinating to read that, because I know that they are a very, from just general knowledge of being a very tough culture and very, and the fact that they like to, that it takes a lot to please someone, but, but also at the same time, there's, the fact that saying, that they have the, if they got 90% on their test or something, they'll still be shamed because they didn't get the 100%, right? So, that was one of the themes that kind of stuck out in terms of that. And also, with respect to the audience, when it comes to workplace cultures, one of the things that comes to mind is a lot of times some cultures are more direct, and then someone from a North American culture who is talking about acceptance and whatnot, they may get offended by the directness of, even Dutch culture. There's a lot of directness.
Particularly, yeah.
Exactly, right? So there's a directness, but people take offense to that because it's like, oh, you're not approving who I am. Their backs will get up, but it's like, no, it's not. That's just how they are. And so these are the kinds of conversations that we have.
The way I'm trying to explain it is, I'll get back to your question about shame, but I'll get directness first. So I, coming from the other side, I felt that I wasn't, I did feel that I wasn't performing well enough. So I felt coming to the US and to some extent, I know Canada is in the US, there are many cultures, of course. In Canada, there are many cultures too. But I think what I recognize as North American and maybe UK related is this idea that you always try to make people feel good about themselves, that you avoid people, you avoid criticizing, you avoid disapproval, you make room for people in a way, you make sure that their self-esteem is confirmed. And I don't think that's always the goal. I mean, it's not that people walk around with this goal in mind, of course, not that they are aware of the goal, but I think when I analyze the goal of conversation in those North American and maybe UK context, I think the goal is to not offend somebody and to make them feel big, to make them feel good about themselves. In every conversation, how are you? I'm doing great. Oh, that's wonderful. It's wonderful that's so wonderful of you. I thank you. That's not what Dutch people do. Dutch people give you information. So a very clear, so my students, I taught at an American university for 10 years. And my students thought that I was abrupt and that I was, some of them knew me and were, but they thought it was rude or blunt. I just merely provided them with information or feedback. Now that was my observation of my own behavior. I'm acculturated enough now to see it, to be able to see it in those different ways. But my idea was that I was giving them information. But it's very true that I wasn't in the business of making them feel great. I wasn't sandwiching my feedback with love as my American mentors did. And as I've come to learn a little bit more, I was just giving them information. And this is in the workplace. Outside of the workplace, exactly the same. Somebody would ask me, would you like to go for lunch? Or would you like to go for lunch tomorrow? And I said, no, tomorrow I have something different. And, and they were waiting for me to say, that's a great idea. How lovely that you asked me. I can't do tomorrow, but would we be able to postpone that to another day? I was just not, it wasn't that I wasn't feeling grateful. Of course I was feeling grateful. Maybe that wasn't my primary feeling, but of course I liked to be invited. I was new there. And I liked the initiative, but that was not the business of communication. And so I think that, if you had asked me, are you grateful that she's asking? I would have told you yes. Do you like the initiative? Yes, I do. But in this moment, I thought I had to provide her with the information that I wasn't available. So I think that's, it's a very innocuous example of where people are just trying to do different things.
Yeah.
I think the shame too, are you trying to, so in some cultures, again, in cultures where people try to feel good as an individual, shame is a horrible emotion, because it tells you that other people are judging you and that you're falling short of the norms, right? And so this is a horrible emotion. And in fact, in a lot of Western psychology, it's called the most painful emotion. It's called an unhealthy emotion. It's not like that in cultures where the main aim is to meet the norms and the expectations from other people. So you can say, is it a wonderful feeling to have? No, it's not. But since people are not in the business of feeling wonderful about themselves and having high self-esteem, it's also not as offensive as it is in Western cultures, where, and especially in the US, I think, and related cultures where you need to feel good about yourself. Yeah. And so in Japan, it's, for example, shame is not related to depression at all, something that we do find in Western. So it just has a different meaning. And the meaning is alerting yourself that you can improve. And that's in fact what people in Asian context often do. So mothers in Asian context tell their children when they should be ashamed. They want children to see when they fall short of the norm. But then it's also less discouraging, because you can just do what you didn't do before. So shame really is the sign that you should improve. And that's one of the examples that I mentioned in the book. It's really interesting in a work environment is they did research with Dutch salesmen and Filipino, that's the word, Filipino sales. And they asked them, to think of situations where they were ashamed in front of a customer. The Dutch were what Western people would assume. So they felt shame. They felt like they had done something wrong, and they really didn't know how to. They felt very uneasy. They withdrew from contact, and in fact, their sales numbers went down because the shame paralyzed them in the interaction. The Filipino salesman, they felt shame. It wasn't a pleasant feeling. They certainly felt that they had fallen short and that that they were seen. But their response was to fix the relationship. And so they reached out to the customers. For them, shame was a sign that they needed to reach out to the customer, that they had something to correct. They did. And so their sales went up. So it's, not only is the meaning of the emotion differently, but it has a completely different position in the relationship. So it basically prompts the Filipino salesman to have more pro-social behavior. And so it's good in their relationship. And that's generally what we also see in the child rearing for Asian, Taiwanese, Japanese children. It's an opportunity to do better, and then to gain the approval of their parents, because they can show that they're actually a good child. They can show they're a good child by having the shame to begin with, because that means they recognize that they fell short. And so they're a child who knows the norms, they're a well-raised, well-educated child. And then it gives them the opportunity to show that they can actually deal with the situation and that they can improve. And so they're in a position where they can make their parents proud by being ashamed. So it's a very different emotion. It's also, you can say, in a way, it's similar. That's why it's being translated. In a way, those stories, if you look at an emotion as a story, those stories are very different stories. They evolve very differently. The behavior of the person who has shame is very differently. But then if you think about it as stories of interactions, the responses of the people around this person with shame is also very different. So what we call shame is similar to some extent. That was why we're calling it shame and the translation of shame. But really, the stories don't quite translate into each other.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And the thing that I wanted to segue, but and I know you talked about it a little bit when it comes to the workplace itself, when there's a general conversation nowadays, especially in the worlds of equity, inclusion, belonging, how do we make our workplace cultures more inclusive, especially when these emotions play out in terms of interactions, whether they're in retail or whether they're doing a business transaction or anything like that, or even if there's a moment of a misunderstanding and there could be discipline involved when really the other person wasn't meaning to act the way they did because either they didn't understand the North American culture or they didn't understand Japanese culture or whatever. So I guess as a person who is who's an equity practitioner, who is an HR or is a manager or something like that, what are kind of some things that someone could look out for if they're interacting with people who are not from their culture, who express themselves differently?
Yeah, there is. I think the first the first thing to say is that we don't know everything about this. So we're still developing the ways in which, we know that emotions differ. We know some of the ways in which they differ. We don't really know how to bridge those differences, except I think the first very important thing is what you just did, is to acknowledge those differences and to second guess ourselves, to say, maybe they didn't mean this. Let me see what was actually the matter with them. Let me see how they interpret the situation. Let me not just infer that from their response, but let me see how they mean it. So I think acknowledging that there are differences and that people may not have emotions the way that you may not understand everything there is when you see somebody, even if that comes naturally to you to interpret behavior. That's, I think, the big number one. And then the second one is that we can ask some questions. We can ask, and we can ask questions mostly about the kind of junctures of emotions where we know that there are differences. So we know that there are differences about why people have emotions. And I just said, why does this situation matter to you? You can usually see, is it a good or a bad situation? And ask people, don't assume you know why it's good or bad, but ask people, why is it good or bad? Or other ways to ask that is, what would you have liked to see? What would you have changed in the situation if you could change it? What would you have avoided? All of those things. I don't think people always, it's very hard sometimes. Emotions are sort of obvious for you because they speak, they present the world in a certain interpretation. And it's not always easy to communicate across cultural boundaries, but I think we need to try that. The second question that you can ask yourself is, you say you understand people in the public transit in the Netherlands. And I do believe that if people are just welcoming and trying to explain to you, that you can understand that. You basically understand if a person wants to be friendly and explain it, or if they're unfriendly. But I think beyond that, we have to be really careful in our interpretation. So I think that you can ask people how they feel, and what is really important and what it means. So, I feel shame doesn't mean that I feel terrible about myself, as I explained in the example. So, I feel ashamed, and okay, so what is the next step? Or what does that mean in your situation? Is that a good emotion? Is that a bad emotion? Is it workable, or does it completely paralyze you? So those are the things that we can ask. Now, another thing that is important is that people in many places of the world do not talk about their emotions in terms of feelings, but in terms of what happens between people. Mm-hmm. So what just happened? Do I feel ashamed, or did you just humiliate me? or
Mhm.
that you just offend me? And what does it mean that you offend me? What do the other people think? So I think often the way of talking about emotions is to talk about how people see what's happening between them and the company, between them and their boss, what they think the boss wants to do with them, what they think the boss should want to do with them, how they feel treated. Is it fair? What would they think would be fair? Why is it not fair? So you can talk about emotions in a way that doesn't only use emotion words, but that talks about what is going on between people. And I think for many people in the world, that's a more palpable way of talking about what's going on than talking about internal emotions. In fact, a lot of people in the world don't think emotions matter.
Mhm.
So what you feel doesn't so much matter, but what you see in the world and how you interpret and whether it's wrong or right, that matters. And then I think a way of understanding emotions is to understand what it means in terms of behavior. So if you see the situation this way, what would you do next? What does it mean for you? You know, I can tell you're angry, but what does that mean exactly? Are you going to withdraw? Are you going to hit on me? Hit me? Are you going to? And also very importantly, I think it's important to know how other people would view, people in that context would view the person who is involved. So, for example, there are a lot of honor cultures where you humiliating me is something that is horrible for my position in the world. It means that everybody sees that I'm not good for anything person. And my only valuable response to come back is to be really aggressive and make sure that I can't do it. Which also means that an angry person or an aggressive person isn't always a person who thinks that isn't that sometimes all a person can do to restore their honor or their public position. So it's important, I think, to understand what this situation means for a person's general standing, for how they feel about themselves, how they perceive others would feel about them. So these are some of this. It's actually, I call it my toolbox. It's a very loose toolbox, very loosely defined. But I do think knowing how emotions can be different can give you entries into the conversation. And ultimately, I think there are no shortcuts to having that conversation than just having it. So it's I can provide. When I will say when I started, when people started asking me those questions, what I thought I should do is give them a full taxonomy of this is how how emotions in the world work. This is how they work. And then I realized, I couldn't tell you that for Dutch emotions, because my Dutch emotions are different than my mother's, are different than my neighbor's. So what am I telling you about the Dutch emotions? But what makes sense is to give you some ways of looking at emotions, some tools of understanding and analyzing what is at play when people have emotions and how that can differ in different cultures. So I think that, this is the best we can do. And then, of course, knowing some examples of how widely different emotions are helps as well. So,
yeah, no, there's so much you said there. And, there's a lot of things that I'm thinking about. And I know when I was first trying to get at the whole emotion regulation side of things, I think what I was looking for, and now I think we can bring it out, is when you have two separate cultures here, what I'm thinking is, regulating those emotions within a workplace that is like that, but then it could have an impact on someone's mental health. And this is now the conversation that we're having about, in terms of someone's mental health in the workplace, how they perceive one person's emotion may be different from another. So the interaction isn't that fluid. So, so then I guess the question is, in terms of the cultural diversity, how it can inform approaches to mental health, and how can that inform approaches to mental health and well-being in the workplace? And, what are some ways that you think, from a mental health perspective, and I know obviously I'm not asking someone who's a mental health expert, but, being still a psychologist in that perspective, what are some approaches that you could suggest, given your experience, would be incorporated, where you can incorporate that for, to accept cultural diversity within the workplace?
Yeah, I think generally, I think starting from the idea that there is diversity in emotions is a condition to having mental health for all. I mean, I think often in many companies there is a model of how a normal person would feel. And I think, there is no the normal person. There are different habits and different, again, within the margins of all being human. But I think how people prefer to be spoken to may be different, what they find important in terms of, feedback culture may be different. There may be different expectations of what it looks like to have positive and negative feedback, or what it looks like when you collaborate. I have an example of my own workplace, which is I'm supervising students and a very diverse group of students. I could think that the normal supervisor-student relationship is that they take initiative and that they bring up their ideas. But I have learned in the meantime that in many cultures, students wait until they're told what to do. And so when their supervisor doesn't do that, they patiently wait until there is an assignment. And so I have to specify that expectation of, I would like to hear your ideas, this for me. And then they could say, I feel uncomfortable doing that. Can you ask me can you specifically tell me when you'd like my ideas? And, and of course, we're building, I think a workplace is also building relationships. And so as in any relationships, you try to accommodate to each other's expectations. You try to be more explicit. And I don't know I have any magic advice beyond that. I think people like to be heard. People like to know what's expected from them. And that is true probably for leaders and for people who work as employees. And it's very hard not to have expectations that are informed by your own cultural backgrounds. So I think keeping an open conversation is a must. I don't know that there are really many shortcuts. I mean, we know from research that this idea that I just said, like taking initiative, having autonomy, that's not the only model for work relationships. Some work relationships is having a much more hierarchical line of work. Like there is somebody who takes the decision and somebody who carries them out. And it's good to have a mutual understanding of what your relationship looks like. And similarly with the kinds of emotions that are allowed or not allowed in the workplace. I think people are very different in their sharing of emotions and what is allowed in the workplace. I think, for example, that in a European culture, there's more allowance for expressing negative emotions, expressing emotions of not being able, sad, not being motivated. I mean, I haven't seen as much room for it in a US context anyway. But there are, of course, still spaces where you can express disappointment and how that's being done. And one of the things that I found difficult working in an American workplace is, how do you say that you disagree or that you dislike things while still being positive? and give each other positive feedback.
And employed.
And employed, yeah. And employed in some cases, yeah. Yeah, that in the university with tenure positions, that's never the first worry, but many people have to worry about that too.
Yeah.
But even in the interpersonal sphere, like, how do you bring this up in a way that's acceptable? And I have to say that, that's you sometimes you're on, sometimes the conversation is open enough that you can ask people, that you can say, this is how we do it in where I'm used, where I grew up. I recognize that that's not the way things are done here, but what is the way things are done here? Suppose that I would agree, where would I bring that in? So I think it's probably the questions that there are individual differences. So any organization has to deal with individual differences too, and with expectation management and clear communication rules. And I think that's even more important when you're with a diverse company.
Yeah.
And another thing to recognize is that in many cultures, I think one of the things to recognize is nobody has no culture. That's sometimes really hard when you're a white, straight, male person to realize. But even that comes with a culture. And so I think what is important, but I don't have cut and dry rules for how to do that, is to recognize that any organization has a culture already. And that even if you don't work on the culture, there's a culture in place that is usually the dominant or the more powerful culture. But that not talking about the culture doesn't mean that there is no culture. It means that there is a default culture that other people have to fit in with. And so it's better to actually talk about what the culture should be, because there always is a culture in place. And so this is another recommendation maybe, is to, for people who don't feel they have a culture, to still think about what their cultural heritage is, what their background is.
Yeah.
So making the exercise that any person who is of color or also has a different kind of cultural context has to do is coming to terms with your culture. Maybe that's something that the default culture has to do too, and that would be an interesting basis of conversation. What is your culture of doing emotions? Is really an interesting starting point.
No, exactly. And I as we talk about understanding cultures, interacting, making business deals, et cetera, in leadership conversations, the big question is, how does emotional intelligence play into supporting cultural diversity in the workplace? So, what role does emotional intelligence have, and how can organizations promote cultural intelligence while supporting the differences in communication styles or collaboration styles across diverse cultures and emotions, or emotional strategies, if you will?
Yeah, I think emotional intelligence is a hugely important idea, and I think we have to become aware that there are emotional intelligences, and that's exactly where we are. I think is we've come to recognize in the business world, in the world of education, that there is more to well performing than just being intelligent in the cognitive way. There's also being intelligent and well informed in the social emotional way. And then I think that, a next step is to recognize that emotional intelligence can be, you can be emotionally intelligent in one culture and not in another. And that there is such a thing as they call it, I think, cultural competence, but there is such a thing as, and I don't like cultural competence as as a term because it suggests that you know everything there is to know about a culture, and that's what you should strive for. We can never know everything there is to know about a culture, but we can become sensitive to how people in different cultures work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can and we should cultivate more social competence in a diverse world, and less think that emotional intelligence is one thing, and that, once you're emotional intelligent in one environment, that you're emotional intelligent in all environments. I think we need to exactly work on the multiculturalism of that concept.
Yeah.
There is, it's really interesting. There is something there. I think there is some transferable skills. I mean, in a way, it's looking at others, paying attention to their motives, paying attention to what they want, what they communicate. And yet, you do need to realize also that those intentions and communications are informed by a larger social cultural context in which people have their experiences. So hugely important, emotional intelligence, and certainly a domain where we psychologists, I think, can add to our understanding in how it works across cultures.
Yeah, and I think and I'm, one of the things that a lot of us, who live in multicultural societies like Canada, as opposed to a place, well, even the UK to a certain extent, but as opposed to the US, we have the talk about accepting different cultures within our workplaces and et cetera, but a lot of people don't have that conversation about you can be culturally competent, and I fully agree with you in that perspective of number one, you can't know everything, right? You need to be naturally curious. And of course, to talk about your book, this is why I was curious about your book, right? Because of the fact of I wanted to build on my cultural curiosity, if you will, of how people act, how people react, how people express themselves, and that would help my decision making as a leader, or even as a consultant, to say, hey, this is how I would interact with certain cultures, especially doing business deals or whatever. But also too, in a place like the US where they've never traveled outside. A lot of people have not traveled outside the US or North America, but yet they can come across and say that, look, I understand this culture, but yet, you don't know what you don't know. And how can you say to someone who's if you're advising a global organization or even a local organization, especially now that cultures are interacting that much more in this global environment, right? So I guess, as for my guests who tend to be equity practitioners, equity, diversity, inclusion practitioners, how, I guess I want to conclude with this in the sense of how can they incorporate, or what should they do to incorporate the cultural diversity, if you will, into their, say, training, or into how they want to, advance equity within their organizations, empathizing for the diverse emotional experiences that exists.
Yeah, I think what you said is very important, is that you, first of all, I think you need to be modest about what you know. And acknowledging differences means that you also second guess your own feelings or your own first intuition, and that you include, I almost would say the way I learned, it's a very long road, but it's mostly in conversations with people who are from the culture, and in conversations and with data, of course, but mostly being really curious and open as I could to what people had to say about how they felt, how they did, why it was, what mattered to them. So I think engaging, not pretending that taking this and being And sometimes I say empathy is actually not a good thing, because empathy means that you think that if you try to imagine how you feel in that person's place, that's enough. No, I don't want to know how I would feel in that place. I want to know how that person feels given their cultural baggage, given what is important to them. So I think it's almost more interesting to know, how do they see this situation? What is important to them in this situation? I'm always, this is not a business example, but I always give the example of, I had a Moroccan friend in the Netherlands. I taught her Dutch lessons, and she, at some point, her husband told her that she couldn't leave the house because she had taken too much liberties and his honor was at stake. Now, if I were to imagine myself in her shoes, I would say, you don't accept it, you're indignant, you're angry. But that's not, that wouldn't have helped my understanding. My understanding was that she lived with him in a culture, in a culture where honor was important, with six children, and that was her view of the world. And so can I imagine, given all of those different things, that she would do what her husband asked her? Yes, I can. That's not the same as really agreeing with it or wishing it for my own life. But I think especially when you give advice to companies in different cultures, in different countries, it's not so important how you would ideally set up a company in your own culture, but how it's workable and realistic, and seen as desirable in that culture, and how you can make things work. And that's, it's not important what you think. If you think that ideally organizations are flat and unhierarchical, in a culture where that's not valued, that's not what you're going to achieve. So my advice would be to always work with people from the culture, and to not assign them only, to the role of execution of the ideas that you have, but to really involve them in designing the company that they can see work in their country. Now, is any person as good as any? Maybe you should involve several people to see, that to be able to see what's cultural and to see what's individual preference. But there's not one Indian or there's not one Japanese person, of course. But I do think that that only in collaboration you can, or that only in consulting people from the culture, that you can actually make it work. So that would be my advice.
And I mean, I could go forever with our conversation. I mean, I love this conversation. I mean, I loved it when we first spoke. I love it when we talk now. So, I mean,
I do too, Andrew.
Thank you. I really appreciate this conversation, and it allows people to get an understanding. And I'm hoping that a lot of people, my suggestion and my strong recommendation is to go out and get your book and read it, because it is an amazing, is eye-opening in terms of understanding cultures. I mean, we talk about how people understand cultural intelligence, cultural competency, cultural, having empathy for different cultures, et cetera, in the workplace. But to really fully understand how to be a part of those, be a part and include people in those conversations, I strongly think that it should be part of that curriculum, whether it's in psychology, social psychology classes, or cultural psychology classes, or even as a professional. It should be mandatory that people read your book. And I'm grateful that I did. I'm grateful for whoever suggested at the time to suggest to read your book, and I commend you for what you did. And I'm, hopefully there's a part 2 to this book. So and I'm pretty sure, as a researcher, I'm pretty sure there's another book coming out that's going to have some sort of relationship with this. So on that note, Batja, I really thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. It was insightful. It was great, and it was great getting to know who you are as not only as a person, but also as a researcher and as an author. So thank you for this, Batja.
Thank you so much, Andre. And I'd like to hear from people in the field, how they apply the book or what kind of problems they still encounter. And my website is batjamesquita.com.
Okay. And I'm sure, and I know, you're on Instagram, you're on other social media platforms, and on LinkedIn and whatnot. So yeah, but definitely go out and get Batja's book. Reach out to her, and of course, once you read her book, go on Amazon and speak about what your thoughts were, and contact Batja when it comes to her book. So on that note, thank you again, Batja, for being my guest, and until next time, we'll see each other for another Global Conversations webcast. Until next time, have a great day, everybody.